You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. We were really
a Mamamia podcast.
My name is Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, an interview podcast from Mamamia with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. This story starts with a dinner. 6 friends are gathered to celebrate a farewell in a fancy restaurant in inner city Sydney. For one of them, a young woman in her 20s called Kirsten Bookallil, it would be a last meal of sorts. Because the next day, Kirsten was having her stomach removed.
I woke up that morning. I couldn't eat the night before, and I remembered just like going to the hospital with Simon, and it was just like one of those things. It was like, we're doing this.
I was one of the 6 people at that final dinner to farewell Kirsten's stomach, because Kirsten is one of my closest friends. We are godmothers to each other's daughters, and one time we even dated the same guy, if by dating you mean slept with, but not at the same time. Anyway, that's a story for another time. Today we're going to talk about what led up to that crossroads in Kirsten's life at that dinner and all the cascading events that came after it. This is a story about love and loss and 4 generations of women. I don't want to give too much away, but this episode of No Filter is like nothing you've ever heard before, which is why we're starting it at that restaurant in Surrey Hills 20 years ago. I want to start this story in a private room of a restaurant called Long Grain, where some people were gathered together for a very special dinner. Do you remember that night?
I can't believe you can remember that. I remember what I ate because that was like such a big thing for me. And I was like, I'm never going to taste this food again. And it was almost like I was never going to put food in my mouth. And it was very famous at the time. They had like pork hock, and it was like triple deep fried. And there was like insane desserts.
It was pretty fancy food.
It was.
Where did the idea come from to have that farewell dinner?
I think because I'd seen my mother and seen how plain the food she ate was, it was the one thing I was like, you know what, I'm not going to be able to enjoy these things again. Although I have been able to, but I knew that definitely for the first couple of years I wouldn't be eating that sort of intense type of food. And unfortunately, food's been really important to me all my life. I'm more of an oral person. I really enjoy food and entertaining and
Do you remember
drinking.
how you felt on that night, going to that dinner and sitting with, there were 6 of us, I think.
Yeah, there were.
3 couples.
I think I was in such a sort of mechanical headspace that I was just like, I wanted to do this because I knew that that was something that was really important to me. And it was almost like a finite thing that I kind of was like, okay, this is my life before and I can mark it by that, and this is going to be my life afterwards. And unfortunately, I think what had happened was that my mother had been so ill that I had looked at it and thought, I'm never going to get back to where I was. I'm kind of going to end up having this half-life. So I was sort of in a little bit of a daze and I think I was nervous, but also trying to be really brave about it because I had a young child and, I had a husband who at the time was like, he was very jolly and kind of like, we're going to get through this. And he was feeling very positive, and I'm sure he wasn't either. So we were just sort of doing these markers as something to kind of make the time go by and kind of to make things okay. And also because it wasn't just us, it was like our friends, I think, were all horrified, and our family, and like everyone was like incredibly supportive, but also at the same time like they were in shock about it. And so you're sort of trying to manage
everyone else's feelings.
Yeah. So it's kind of good because you don't have to deal with things yourself as much because you're like, oh, no, I'm going to be fine. And while you're talking yourself up a little bit, you're able to manage your own feelings about it a little bit.
How long before had your mother been diagnosed with stomach cancer?
So I think this was like the 29th of July that we went for dinner, and the week before that I'd gone. I mean, it's kind of like this timeline of events backwards, but my mother had died on the 25th of June, and she'd had probably about 2.5 years of like recovery from her operation from the stomach cancer that they'd found. And at the time, I mean, it was just such a sort of 2 years that sort of just blended. I can't even really remember the time. I just remember her being well and not well. And
So she'd been diagnosed with the stomach cancer. Was she the first woman in her family to get it?
no, we thought she was. I mean, we sort of knew that her mother had died from stomach cancer, but we didn't know that it genetically was linked. And then my grandmother's sister had died of, I think they thought it was throat cancer. And then their grandmother had died, but they thought it was bowel cancer because unfortunately it sort of grew different ways. And so they all ended up with different end results of cancer. But my mother just sort of had terrible reflux and she sort of, went to doctors and they'd say, I'll put a brick under your bed and don't drink red wine and, just the normal things that you have.
Cut down on spicy food.
Yeah. So she probably didn't do all those things, but she did a lot of those things, but not realising that any of it was related. And then we were on a family holiday and she was just getting worse and worse. And my aunt is a doctor and said, look, I just want to take you in to we need to get this sorted because it's obviously not good.
What was she feeling? She was in pain?
She was in a lot of pain. She couldn't really take down food. And then she could take down little bits of food and she was getting a lot of reflux.
So a lot of digestive issues that were getting worse.
And my mother was like a real warrior and she probably worked too hard and all those sorts of things. So it's sort of, you didn't feel like it was so unusual at the time.
She might have an ulcer.
Yeah,
indigestion.
and that's what we thought. We thought she had an ulcer. And so she was in South Africa and we'd just been on a family holiday in Perth together and she flew to South Africa.
To see her family who were there.
Family. And they put her straight into hospital and got a scope and they found that she had growing out of her stomach into her esophagus a very long sort of extended the cancer had grown upwards. And then they suggested that she have a full gastrectomy, so her full stomach taken out. And at the time that was like, how does somebody live without a stomach? I'd never even heard of, the possibility that, you could actually survive without a stomach. I thought you needed a bag it didn't seem possible that you could kind of live with it. And so I flew over to South Africa. She had the operation and we were all in a bit of shock. We sort of couldn't believe that it had got so, within a week, it had just sort of escalated and got so bad. And then when you're recovering, it takes you, it's like having a newborn baby. You're teaching your body to accept food again. And
how can you live without a stomach?
It's quite remarkable. It's sort of that thing of where you cut off a leg and your body still thinks you have it. It's like if you don't tell your body that there's a problem, it can actually manage with so many different issues. You go to a doctor and they'll say you're low in iron or you have a lot of nutritional issues. You'll never really know, but you're not sleeping properly or it sort of presents itself in other ways.
What do?
They cut from your esophagus and because the type of stomach cancer we have is if any, like even a little bit of your stomach, a cell is left inside, that will grow into the cancer. So they have to make sure at each end between the large intestine and the esophagus that there's no attachment of the stomach cell wall.
So they take out the whole stomach.
Yeah.
And just attach those two
bits
ends
together.
of the pipe together.
Yeah. But what they do is they get the esophagus and they kind of bend it because you don't want to vomit up the bile from your large intestine because it's much stronger. It's like battery acid. It's much stronger acid than what you have in your stomach. So they kind of do this thing so you can't vomit, and it means that if you get any acid that reflux, which you do, it comes up a little bit and it burns, but it doesn't burn too much.
And does your intestine just take over the job of being your stomach?
It does. It's so clever. But the problem is for the first couple of months, what it's doing is it's learning to store food. So it actually creates its own little sacks of food that your food sort of falls into and stays, and it stretches out parts of the intestine, and that's incredibly painful because it's sort of your body's readjusting itself and it's making a stomach. So you end up having these sort of deposits as you go along of places that your food kind of ferments and breaks down, and then your body sort of absorbs it. And it's very clever. It's quite remarkable.
When did it first strike people that maybe there was a genetic link and that maybe other members of your family should be tested for this same cancer?
I think, my aunt, because she's a doctor and she's got a much better understanding of it, I think she definitely saw a link very early on. But they sort of talked about the possibility of it, but I don't think they really knew that there was definite link. And about a year into my mother's recovery, she started seeing a really amazing woman called Professor Kathy Tucker. And Kathy is head of the Hereditary Cancer Centre at the Prince of Wales. And she's the most remarkable woman, and she actually did the testing for my mother and for our family, and then realised that we did have this very rare genetic, which is often found in Scottish families and in Maori families. It's quite an unusual sort of link. But we have a Scottish side to our family, and that's where they think the link came from.
Even though you are half Maori.
I know.
That's just a happy coincidence. Or
it's like the Maori family of my side luckily didn't have this, but apparently a lot of Maori families have it. So I was thinking, I'm going to get the double whammy, but it is very rare. It's something like 2% of cancers of this diffuse gastric cancer. So it's not very common at all. And we were really lucky that the head guy who does all the testing for it, he's in New Zealand. And so he was able to do the testing. It took a couple of weeks. It came back and it said, yes, she does have this ecahedron gene.
Your mother did?
Yeah, faulty ecahedron gene. And that's what it is, and that's the genetic link. So if you put a doctor in front of me, they'd probably go, no, it's this and this and this. And it's like, but this is how I remember it.
Did you all get tested before your mum died? She wasn't able to beat the cancer. It spread.
No.
And she sadly died a couple of years later.
Yeah, she died at 50. And I think I've said this to you before that I always, at the time, I was like, 50 is a good age. It's like she lived a good life. And now I'm
Was she that young?
And now I'm 48. I'm like, oh, my God, to have only 2 more years, it's like I feel like I'm just beginning life in many ways.
So tell me a little bit about the life stage you were in and the aftermath of her death, those first couple of weeks, putting your own health to one side. Who did you have to look after in your life?
So I think one thing that we sort of talked about at the beginning of this was the timeline, which is that my mother got sick. She was sick for 2 years, and then she passed away on the 25th of June. And my husband and I had been really wanting another child. We had one child who was 2, and my mother had had another child when I was 17. They say maternal siblings, whether or not you share the same father, are actually very close. And my sister and I are.
How old was she when your mum died?
She was 11, but she came to us a little bit before that just because my mother was so ill.
So you adopted her essentially, you and your husband.
Yeah, we became her carers.
So you had a grieving
carers.
little girl who was 10 or so.
Yeah.
You had, how old was Stella, your
Stella
daughter?
was just about, she was 2, nearly 2.
You just lost your mum.
Just lost her.
And you had been alerted to the fact that because this was a hereditary cancer, you needed to get regular endoscopes, which meant they put the camera down and just look in your stomach and make sure nothing's growing there. And they said if you do that regularly, that'll just means that, things won't get as far along as they were with your mother before she was diagnosed. So 6 weeks after she died.
I went to have an endoscope because I thought, look, my doctor had said, and I thought was correct, is that the way that gastric cancer presents itself is generally the same as when you're pregnant. So you have like heartburn, you can have nausea, all the sort of very similar things. And he said, you're going to be really nervous during the whole pregnancy that something's actually wrong. And my mother had, she had just passed away. My grandfather actually had passed away about 2 weeks after her.
Oh,
so it was like...
And you were wanting to get pregnant.
And I was like...
But needing to go and get checked.
Yeah. And I was like, I just want to get past all this. I want to have a baby and, have some nice things. And my mother knew I had the gene when she died. So that was like, I was the first one to get tested. And it came back. I was like pretty horrified at the time that I had the gene. But I sort of thought, you know what, I was 28 and I was like, it hits you when you're 40. It's, there's technology. There's a whole lot of things behind me. I didn't worry about it too much.
But they were worried that it seemed to, in every generation, be coming
Earlier.
10 years earlier.
Yeah.
Like your mother got it in her mid-40s.
Yeah.
Her mother got it in her mid-50s. It was getting younger with each generation and more aggressive.
I felt quite secure in the fact that I was in great shape.
Did you have any symptoms?
Nothing, not at all. I felt perfectly fine, and I didn't have any sort of tiredness or anything that you would think.
And then what happened?
Well, I saw this guy called Gary Buckland, and I was told he was incredible, and he found the cancer. I went in for the day surgery, and I woke up and he was like at the bedside, he was like nearly in tears, and he was like, come to my office. And I just knew because of the way he was. I was like, they found it.
You don't want your doctor in tears.
No, but he was like so lovely.
Yeah.
But I could see in his eye, there was just something, I was kind of like not feeling confident about the results. And so we went into his office and they got the biopsies back, and he was like, and it is actually remarkable because the stomach wall looks like a rock face. It's like really lumpy. So what happens with the type of cancer we have, it grows in the wall. By the time it's come out, it's really protruding, and it normally goes the other way, not in the stomach. It normally heads out. So to find it, he'd found it in the stomach wall, and it had only grown out 3 centimetres. And it was the most incredible thing that he'd found it, because it's a needle in a haystack.
3 centimetres seems like a lot though.
I know, but when you're thinking of stomach wall, you think of like a brain, like you see lamb's brains, and it looks like you wouldn't know what was in and what was out. And so he found it, which was absolutely remarkable. But at the same time, he said, look, I had to cut into it to do the biopsy, and this type of cancer grows really fast. So he was like, you've got to have a full gastrectomy next week. That was kind of like the biggest thing. I was like, oh my God. And my husband at the time was just like, we were both just crying because we were just like completely, it just was the shock of it. And it's still like, now I just think I can feel sitting at his like hard desk and just thinking, because all I saw was a death sentence. It's like I didn't want to believe it was, but I just seen my mother go through this, I couldn't imagine that having the operation would be any better than it was. But she certainly paved the way in that she was incredibly gracious. She was incredibly positive about it all. But I think that for myself—
But no one wants to die. How old were you?
No,
28?
I was 28, and I just had a very young child.
And you had a grieving little sister that you are now her mum, essentially.
But there was a part of all of that I knew that I wasn't going to die. Just this I was like, I can't. I've got like a child. I've got my sister. I was like, and then I sort of thought, my mother survived for 2 years. Maybe I can push, I can do better than that.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Kirsten Bookallil. How did you tell Jemima, the little girl who'd just lost her mum?
I think my mother kind of instilled this. We had to talk about death a lot for 2 years, actually. And sometimes when you're talking about death, you don't believe it's going to happen. But we sort of were very good about talking about outcomes and what happens with things that aren't good and the possibility of things not being good. So there's kind of a realism about my family, which is quite good. And I think even Stella was like a young baby and kind of saying to her, we're going into hospital. And she was really into Jessie, Cowgirl. And so we're like—
Oh, from Toy Story.
She was really into that. So it was like, you're going to come and you can bring your horse, and you try and make hospitals fun for a child.
Quite simple, not simple, but, for a 2-year-old, it's like mummy's going into the hospital. But for Jemima, who's 11, who's just buried her mum, and now her other mum has got the same thing that caused her mum to die, how did you make that okay for her?
I don't—
While you were going, holy shit.
I'm just going for a run.
I'm just going to go for a run before I get my stomach removed.
Yeah. I'm sure there was a lot of fear there for her, and she handled it very, very well, as did everyone else in my family. And I think everyone in my family was scared, for themselves as much for me. And it just felt like we'd just been through this 2 years of like intensity with my mother, and it had been incredibly sad to lose her. But we were still in this place where we're all just quite connected still. And I'm sure you know that. It's like when you've had something in your family where you're all like talking on a daily basis, and you sort of, there's this very tight-knit
So it's kind of like being at war. It's like, well, what's the next battlefront that we're going to? Okay, you're getting your stomach removed.
Yeah.
When you went into that operation, or the night before, did you have an actual last meal? I mean, we had our restaurant last meal, but did you actually think, I'm never going to get to eat this again? Were there certain things that you were told when you had no stomach were gone for you forever?
Oh, look, I'd just seen such a terrible recovery with my mother, and I just had to keep reminding myself that she really had presented.
At a very advanced stage, whereas you were early, you were younger, you were healthy.
And there was spread. And I think with myself, it was very, very hard to project forward that this was going to be all right, but I had to. It's like you have no choice. You've got to put one foot in front of the other. It's almost just like D-Day, and it was looming, and it was quite good. It was a week. You know, it's like it was done. I woke up that morning. I couldn't eat the night before, and I remembered just like going to the hospital with Simon, and you know, it was just like one of those things. It was like, we're doing this. And we'd only 2 years before been into the hospital to have Stella. So I think it was just one of those things. We were just like, oh, here we are again. And we'd also been at the hospital so much with my mother that it becomes a place you kind of know it's not scary. And I trusted all the doctors a lot. And I think they say that when you have these really big operations, you become quite enamoured with your doctors.
Yeah,
and you
like a bit like you fall in love with your obstetrician.
You do. You
if you have one.
do.
Yeah.
It's just like suddenly they're this person who's saving your life, and they're doing these incredible things. And I remember like a week after the operation, I was like, I want to send him something. I want to, you know, you kind of feel like you can't do enough for what they've done for you and helped you. And yet this is kind of what they do on a daily basis.
How did you feel after the operation? Like in the weeks after?
Well, it's funny because I really remember very clearly coming out of the operation and just hearing everyone around me and talking kind of like I wasn't there, and I was like, I can hear you. And just shadows and sort of being able to see people washing me. And I just remembered that first night when I was in the ICU, and there were these really lovely Filipino nurses, and they would bath you. And I just remember thinking, I'm actually okay. And then they lifted me to one side, and I was like, oh, my God, what is that pain? And it was like it was my stomach, and I could just feel all the kind of – because it was more localised. And
you were on morphine. I remember coming and visiting you and you were on
know.
morphine. You didn't like that very much.
No, I hated it. And I think it's also – it depends what drugs suit you. It's like for me that sort of weird sort of –
You're not a morphine girl.
No, I'm not. It's not my high. It really isn't. And I remember saying to the doctor, can you take me off this? It's like I keep jumping off buildings like 50 times in a day, and it's
exhausting.
Just,
I'm tired.
Like, I'm exhausted from how scared I am. And he was like, oh, it's a bit early, but they did take me off it. And I actually think coming off the drugs quickly was the best thing, because you're able to work out very quickly what's pain and what's, you know, I think if you mask it all, then you come out of hospital and suddenly you're like, I can feel this and I don't know what it is. And I was able to deal with it a lot while I was in hospital.
So if someone spent a week with you now on holidays, would they know that you didn't have a stomach?
Probably not. I think I talked about it a lot with people in the first couple of years. It was difficult because people would get really shocked by it, and you don't want that. You don't want them to feel like you need extra care. It was just like, oh, I can't eat that. And they'd be like, oh, are you gluten intolerant?
What can't you eat?
Well, I can't at the moment now. I eat everything. I'm in a great place.
So how many years down the track? 20?
It was 2002, so it's like
almost 20 years.
Almost 20 years, which is amazing.
For the first few years, there were some things you couldn't eat, like
oranges.
Why oranges?
Lettuce and
celery,
because they're very fibrous. So anything that fibrous, if you eat it, and it can wrap around your intestines, and then you can have blockages and all those sorts of things. So my body's quite used to now breaking that up. I don't have any problem with it. But you definitely can't eat and drink at the same time because the fluid pushes the food too quickly through your intestines.
But I've had like dinner with you and you've had a glass of wine and a steak or pasta or whatever it is.
I know, but not a lot. So I can't really I don't get enough fluid in my day really. I've got this water sitting here and I'm like, I should just keep drinking it. But there's moments where I can drink one glass of wine, but I can't sort of keep hydrating during and eating and drinking too much together because it's sort of, you get a dumping syndrome, which is when you drink after you've eaten and it pushes it through and you get, it's exactly the same feeling that diabetics get, where you start heavily sweating. Everything becomes the walls start sort of moving. You get a sugar high and then you flatline and suddenly you're sweating a lot and you have no energy, and pain is associated with it as well.
So things like you could have a steak and chips.
I can now. I can have a steak and chips. I can have, raw meat. And
Why would you eat raw meat?
Like Japanese, like very fine raw meat.
I more meant bulky things like...
Oh, I can eat a hamburger.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's the amount. Like if I eat a hamburger, I generally don't have both. I try and have it bunless because actually for me the nutrition is what is inside. Whereas the bread, I can't have big meals. So I can have all of that over a period of an hour. I'll have half and half, and I eat constantly throughout the day. So if I'm at work, I'm just like that person who's always putting things in their mouth. And I think that's the only time that I might explain to someone, if I'm spending a period of time with them, that I have different eating, and everyone's into this whole grazing and,
You've been doing it before. It was trendy.
I was like doing it way before. But look, I feel like you can't really tell with me now.
Is it similar, the way your body works now and the way you have to eat? Is it similar to someone who has had weight loss surgery or gastric banding?
It's different because they can actually end up stretching it and it can quickly sort of end up the other side. They stretch their stomach out again because it's so elastic, a stomach. But unfortunately, it's just that I need to eat small meals
all the
time.
I remember one of the first things that happened, you were always very slight, but after the operation, you lost a lot of weight. A lot of people would assume that would be the case because suddenly you've got no stomach. What was the reaction? You work in the fashion industry and...
I think we talked about this before because I went into the surgery and that was the other thing. I had to put on weight for the surgery. So
in a week.
I was like, can I have extra fries with that and a thick shake? And, I was like really cramming it in. And you can't actually put on that much weight in a week. But I went into surgery and I was like 60 kilos. And then for 10 days I didn't eat anything. They were feeding me. And I thought, God, in 10 days I'll lose a lot of weight because, not getting any food, I'm just getting fluids. You don't lose that much weight. It's quite remarkable. Your body sort of has such safety mechanisms to keep it on. But I probably ended up at 48 kilos. And the other thing is that I can't ever feel full. And it's almost like losing your sense of taste because it's such a small thing, but when you don't ever feel full, you never feel satisfied. So you kind of have this thing where you're like,
I didn't know that.
I can never feel satisfied with things. And then I'd be like, I can go shopping. I found other ways. I probably went into other areas where I was like, that satisfies me a little bit, but I just want something that makes,
But how do you know when to stop eating? Just because you look and you've eaten what's on a plate and that's probably enough?
It's something I had to learn because if I eat too much, I get a lot of pain.
But it's not a physical sensation that tips you off that you're going to get that.
And it's just suddenly you get the pain and you're like, I've eaten too much.
So you've got to learn it.
You've got to learn it. And it's sort of trial and error for a long time. And, I'd be at all these really fancy restaurants and I'd be like in the bathroom not able to eat the food. And, and because I can't vomit, it's like I can't change the direction.
If you can't vomit?
Well, I can a little bit now. It's amazing. Your body just
so great.
I know, who would have thought we'd be like high-fiving over that. But yeah, over time that's changed a bit. And I think it's just that my body's learnt to move things around a little bit more. But what happens if I get food poisoning, and that was the thing for many years, was travelling. I had to be careful that I went places where they had good hospitals. And I never actually ended up in hospitals because I just, we went to Italy after 6 months after my operation and I just basically ate pasta with butter and nothing else just because I was nervous. I just didn't want to end up in an Italian hospital and I went, to India at one stage and, it's like I just had to cheese sandwiches and, be really, really careful because if I have a stomach bug, they basically just have to put you on morphine because you can't bring it up and get rid of it. They need to put you on something and just let it pass through.
Oh,
and it's
wow.
the passing through that's very painful.
So your family lost your mother, then watched you go through your operation and recovery. Everyone's still grieving and reeling. What happens then? Because you now know that this is a genetic cancer. Does it only affect women?
No, it does affect men as well, but the percentage is much less.
So how many people in your family had to get tested?
So we had my aunt and uncle got tested first because it sort of works that way. And my aunt had the gene and my uncle didn't. So it meant that his children and family were fine. And then my sister got tested as well during this sort of spree that we did. And my sister had the gene. And it's a 50-50. So
Did you tell her?
yes, we did.
How old was she when she was tested?
She was 16 because legally she had to be 16 to have the testing done. You can have it done earlier, but we thought it was sort of a good mental age to be able to deal with it. And also by then I was in a better stage and she could look at me and go, oh, she's doing really well. And, you know,
So
it wasn't
being
a death
diagnosed
sentence.
with the gene means that you have to have your stomach removed, otherwise you are going to develop the cancer.
They say with this type of cancer, because it's so strong, basically a 90 to 95%, if you have the gene, you'll get the cancer. So my aunt had the gene and then she has 3 children. And my cousin Alice, unfortunately, she, you know, that thing of it skips a generation and it comes
earlier and earlier.
So she was only in her 20s and she, you know, had been similar thing and, a daughter of a doctor. You know, you think we would have been onto it by that stage, but she just sort of was having reflux and she was probably more anxious. And so it was very hard to sort of say it's this because she was only just 20 and she'd been having problems since she was in her teens, but, you know, no one had thought about it like that. And she was more like my mother. It had spread for her. And what my aunt did, which was very clever at the time, instead of having the operation, she had her do sort of very heavy radio to shrink it, and then they did the operation. So we sort of, as a family group, we've sort of learnt how to deal with it, and everyone has a different response to their operation as far as what they can eat straight after, how they feel, even though we've all had the same
How many
experience.
people in the family have had the operation to remove their stomachs?
5 of us, and then 6 including my mother, who was sort of we're all alive because she did this for us. So it's quite a remarkable thing. And we're almost like we should do a cookbook in our family, but it's like one of those things that, you know, Carmen's muesli bars like saved my life for years because it was all I ate. And then my aunt in South Africa was getting Carmen's muesli bars sent to her, and then she found a distributor there. And it was
Why
like,
Carmen's muesli bars?
because they don't have a lot of sugar in them, and so we wouldn't get sort of shaky from them. And the oats, like they'd sort of be that thing that they'd help you and sustain all day. So it was
So you all had passed on to each other, here's how
Yeah.
you go after the operation. So your sister was diagnosed at age 16. You must have been worried about your daughter, who was by then 5 or 6.
Look, I think it's a really difficult thing. It feels, even though we were like all talked about it and we were a very close-knit family about it, it did feel really hard to say to my husband at the time, you know, I felt really responsible. It felt dirty, you know, that you've kind of given him this child that is not perfect. But I think, you know, that was the remarkable thing about him is that he's very good in business and he's very good in kind of day-to-day because he gets a problem and he just pushes through it. And he doesn't want to delve deeply into it. And that's how he was with this. He was like, okay, she has the possibility, a 50-50 possibility. And he just kind of pushed through it and just kind of, you know, was like, okay, let's have another baby. And, you know, he just found other gateposts to jump over.
How was the decision to have another baby? Because if you were going to have another baby, you risked this baby having the gene as well.
We ended up doing genetic IVF for this baby, and it was something that was only just readily available. It was quite sort of, at the time, it was a bit Frankenstein, but we'd both read about it and it was very expensive, and we were like, oh, you know, but we also knew at the time my husband was really, really keen to have another child, and it was one of those things like, you know, maybe she was a little bit of a Band-Aid in the sense that
For the marriage.
For the marriage. I was like, you know what? You've always wanted another child.
Because you had a lot going on, my God.
It was.
So you would
have
have
a little bit.
I also remember you saying at the time you felt guilty both ways because you said if we do genetic IVF, my first daughter didn't get the benefit of that. So is it fair to her? But then if we don't and we have a baby with the gene when we could have had the chance of not having a baby with the gene, is that then fair to the next baby? So I know for a time you really wrestled with that decision.
Yeah, look, I wasn't brought up particularly religious with sort of views on it either way, but I did feel like we were choosing something that, you know, nature hadn't given us. But at the same time, it's like medicine is so remarkable and it changes so quickly that you also have to believe in the power of modern medicine and what it can do for you. And to live through another 10 years while we waited, or even longer, 16 years before we could test for this child whether it was genetically okay or not, it felt like the IVF solution was the best way forward.
So you had another little girl,
Yes.
Bronte.
Yes.
And Stella hadn't had the gene test yet.
No.
Your sister knew she did have the gene.
Yes.
How old was she when she had the operation, and how did you make that decision as to when it would be?
I mean, the HSC is such a big thing for kids, and we just sort of thought we don't even want her to have to deal with anything before she's 18. But it's a very fine line of like it can hit between – we knew with my cousin it could hit quite early with her, and so we basically decided that once she'd finished her HSC that we'd do it soon after that.
Instead of schoolies.
Instead of schoolies, it's like, no, you can't go to the Gold Coast and, you know, drink, but we've got something better planned for you.
Wow. That's also tough for an 18-year-old. I mean, it's tough for anyone, but at 18 when you don't really want to be responsible.
No. And I was like, for my sister, it was like the perfect sort of teenage going into, it's like it'll make her responsible because she won't be able to drink a lot and she won't be able to, she's going to have to look after herself. And it's that thing when they move out of home and they don't look after themselves as well. I kind of, you know, there was this side of me, I was like, she's going to have to really think about her food. But it'll, you know, you worry about a life like that. You know, I had a partner who helped me and supported me through all of this, and I worried about that for her because she was sort of at this, you know, stage where she was hopefully going to go out and meet people and, you know, so I had a lot of fears for her in kind of longevity of, you know, how her life would look. And
she did pretty well in the operation though, didn't she?
She did remarkably.
She certainly showed you up.
I know. And I think she was eating hamburgers like that's
she nailed it.
A week later she was eating hamburgers, and that's the thing in my family. It's always like, when did you have your first hamburger? That sort of, you know, it's like, and my sister did better than anybody. She was like.
And then you discovered that Stella didn't have the gene.
Yeah,
finally.
We got her tested when she was 16, and it was one of those things, we did it before her HSC because Stella has a really sensitive digestive system. And so whenever she had like, you know, something, I'd be so stressed about it.
I remember you saying, I'm pretty sure she's got the gene because she's got a lot of the same symptoms that I had. I just think she's got it. And so it was quite a surprise when she didn't, right?
No. I was like, I was almost annoyed. I was like, oh, I've been worrying about you for all these years and you don't have anything.
So your sister, everyone's starting to get ticked off the list, right? So it's looking like it has been stamped out for the next generation. You know that your daughters, it's done in terms of your genetic line.
Absolutely.
It's done. However, there was a link between this particular genetic stomach cancer and breast cancer, a type of breast cancer called lobular breast cancer, which meant that you weren't yet out of the woods.
No, I wasn't. And I think, you know, I was lucky because there was a good 10, maybe 15 year.
When you didn't have anything removed.
No. And I just every 6 months I went and had an MRI.
Because lobular breast cancer can be hard to detect in a mammogram.
Yeah.
I learnt this being your friend all these years.
Yes.
And anxiously awaiting the results of every screen that you had.
Yeah.
So you would have an MRI to check.
Yes. And
every 6 months.
It got to a period where it was just like as I got closer to 40, I knew I had to do it. But what was lucky for me...
Had you been told that you do have to have a double mastectomy?
I was told by Kathy Tucker when I was probably in my early 30s. She said, you really need to start thinking about this because as you hit 40, that's when it might present itself. And she sort of put it into very simple terms. She said, I have a 70% chance of developing breast cancer. Oh. She said, but if I told you had a 50-50, she said, that's still a lot. She said, so 70% is, she said, that's high. She was like, if you know that you're 20% over, you know, what a lot of people, she said, you wouldn't even think about it any other way but to have it done.
But you were not ready for a long time.
No, look.
We argued about this.
I know.
It's easy for me to say they weren't my boobs.
And it wasn't even the particular attachment. It was just like having another thing removed and just I kind of.
And you were single by this stage.
I was. And I was, look, it didn't bother me the way it looked. It was just more having to go through it on my own and kind of, even though it was actually, I've always been lucky, you know.
I love how you keep saying this. It's beautiful. It's like, and then I had to have something else removed, but I've been very lucky.
No, because I had so much, like I had a really, you know, you were there, you know, an amazing support for both of these periods of my life. But you really, it's like that support that you have from your family and friends is what gets you through to this point. And you kind of, it's through everything. It's through deaths and, you know, births and marriages and all those sorts of things. But I feel like there were two things that I had on my side with the double mastectomy was that medicine has changed a lot in 15 years and you used to have 2 operations for a double mastectomy. And it was like you would have the breast expanders put in, and then you go back and have another operation and you'd have the reconstruction. So it was sort of a very long drawn out and there was a lot of time you'd have infections and, you know, it was a very difficult operation. And my stomach operation was something like 9 hours and this operation was 9 hours again. And so I thought, oh, it's going to be so difficult. And it morphine again.
Jumping off buildings. I was
actually happier the second time on morphine. I was like, oh.
Suits me now. I've grown into it.
I don't know why I hated this so much. But they now have this amazing stuff which is like it's like a bandage which has got human cells in it and they make a hammock and they stitch it in and sort of they can hammock the implant against your wall of the chest and sort of create the shape of it. And it's really remarkable. So you only have to have one operation and it just means that you've got to have a surgeon and a plastic surgeon working at the same time. And I think with me they were very conscious of that because I was younger and it's like, you know, I'd always thought that fake breasts, I'd never really known how to tell. Now I can spot a fake breast like miles away. It's sort of the shape and, you know, they're quite different. And it's like I got to choose my size.
What was that like? How did you choose? Because you were never very big breasted.
No.
How did you choose? Do you have them all lined up on a table or something?
No, they just talk about it and they've got pictures and they're sort of, but I don't feel like, I think for me, I'd always been small-breasted and I'm athletic and I kind of like being able to wear certain things. And I know that if I had bigger breasts, you'd see them a lot more and I just didn't want that. So I chose an A when actually I'm a B cup. So I actually went a bit smaller because I'd always thought of Tori Spelling and, you know, she'd have those really sore-looking hard.
Yeah.
Because with a fake breast, you normally put on top of your real breast. So you've got the shape of your normal breast underneath. But with
a reconstruction,
they take everything out. It's actually quite hard to make.
That's why it took longer.
Yeah, to make a very natural-looking breast. And look, when they took the cells out and they did the biopsy, they did find the cancer growing. So I was very lucky in my timing and medically when I was able to have this operation because I was able to.
So if you'd have delayed it for another year or even 6 months.
Yeah, you just don't know. So, you know, there's weird, strange blessings. And I think people that if I listen to podcasts about people who've had cancer or issues in their body, you always feel incredibly blessed by things that it's not a Pollyanna effect, but it certainly makes you feel happy with like very simple things that have happened in your life afterwards.
How's your family doing now, the extended family? Is it coming to the end of its life, this evil cancer?
Look, I think I'm the only person in the family who's had the double mastectomy, but for me, it was an age thing. I was coming to a place. My cousins are a lot younger than me. So
they still have to have that, and your sister still has to have that.
Yeah. But my sister's only 30 still, so she's still got a little while to have time to kind of come to terms with it. And again, medically, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Does move very fast. And they might be able to pick up things or, all of that might change. And I think we're all sitting in a place where we're just taking it easy now, because I think there were so many things that happened. And, for me, I think even when I'm trying to explain to somebody elements of what's happened, I had stomach cancer and then my mum died and I had my sister and, it's a lot. And I think most of my friends just now are having their parents dying and just now finding lumps in their breasts. And I feel, like it's quite good because I have this information and I can help them. And I think there's certain people who deal with that type of stress better. And I think I've been very lucky for myself that I want to move past it, but I don't want it's defined me so much. I can't not have it be a big part of my life.
What a story, huh? I have become so well versed in genetic cancer and what it means and the very complicated decisions that come with that, not just for you, but for your future children or your children if you have them. And they're such emotional decisions because in many cases you're being asked to make them at a time when you are grieving or when you are very triggered by the thought of losing a relative who might have passed. And I think when you haven't been through it, it's easy to just go, oh, well, of course, you just get it removed. You just get it, get your breast cut off or you just get your ovaries removed. But I was looking at an Instagram post just a couple of days ago by Camilla Franks, and she has also been diagnosed with a cancer gene. She's got the BRCA gene, which means that she's at high risk of developing not just breast cancer, which she did develop, but also other cancers connected to that. So cancers of the ovaries and fallopian tubes. And she had her breast removed when she was diagnosed with cancer just a few weeks after having her daughter. But then she really wanted to have another child. But at the same time, she knew she had this time bomb in her, which could go off at any time. So she wrote in this beautiful post about the grief of saying goodbye to her ovaries and, the hope of carrying her own biological child in the future and how that grief was real. And even though we are so lucky to have the benefit of science and know about these genetic cancers in many cases, the decisions that you then have to make after you know are not easy and they're not simple. So I hope you learnt some things by listening to Kirsten speak. Her story is extraordinary. Sometimes I forget how extraordinary it is because I've kind of lived it alongside her for so long. If you like this episode of the show, can I ask a favour? Can you go to wherever you get your podcasts, maybe the Apple Podcast app or Android, and leave a review and a rating, because that helps other people to find it. And also maybe send this show to a friend if you think they might find it interesting or it might help them in some way. The assistant producer of No Filter is Lucy Neville. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff, and I'm Mia Friedman. I'll see you on Mamamia.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.